So, Nando, we did get some bad news just yesterday about the unionization effort in Bessemer, Alabama. And it's important to do a postmortem. Jane McAlevey wrote a pretty good one in The Nation. But you've got your own well thought out produced segment on it. So why don't you jump into it?
All righty. Yeah, it's tough because the results of the unionization drive in Bessemer, Alabama are in, and they were a crushing blow. The no votes for the union outnumbered the yes votes by a margin of around 2-1. And it was the latest example of just how weak labor is and how dominant capital is right now, especially Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, we should read a lot into this. It does feel that Amazon is indestructible right now. I mean, find me a company that handled a union drive worse than Amazon did over the past few months. They've had employees, basically sending photos of them peeing in bottles on the job. They've dared members of Congress to provide proof, and the workers have come out and provided that proof. And yet they crushed the union in this effort. So it really just goes to show you that the state of American labor right now is pretty weak. And Amazon, I mean, that was the biggest challenge to them. Were they going to change the way that these fulfillment centers work? And it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case anytime soon. So if you're Amazon, you're in a pretty entrenched position right now.
So how did this happen? I mean, the unionization drive in Bessemer was unique compared to other similar campaigns in recent years, and that it was so high profile. We saw major national politicians and celebrities go down to Bessemer. The campaign got the attention of not just left media, but the mainstream press and even cable news. And there was this feeling that given all the attention to the horrible working conditions at Amazon and the outpour of support from around the country, that maybe, just maybe, these workers could do it. And the truth is that the union campaign was likely doomed from the start because Amazon won a key victory early on. They were able to dramatically expand the size of the bargaining unit from 1,500 workers to close to 6,000.
Are you surprised, not necessarily by the results, but that the results seem to be so much in favor, by better than 2-1, in favor of Amazon, not the union here?
Well, I'm saddened, but I'm not completely surprised because of the kind of compromises that the union had to take in order to get to an election. They had to be willing to accept into the petition for bargaining unit a substantial number of employees that Amazon was pressing to include. These were seasonal employees. Seasonal employees are generally not considered part of a bargaining unit for union election. But this was allowed. Otherwise, it would have been tied up in litigation for the better part of the year. And the longer it took for it to go to election, the more time Amazon would have had to work its anti-union campaign against the union. But as it stands, it looks like they were effective anyhow.
Now, it's hard to overstate just how crucial this was to thwart the union. Amazon used a Trump-era NLRB decision that made it easier for employers to determine the size of the potential bargaining unit. Expanding the bargaining unit is a classic union-busting tactic. The more workers you have to convince, the harder it is for organizers with limited resources and time to organize them. So this early decision was crucial in thwarting the campaign. But there was another structural advantage that Amazon had that wasn't as discussed, and it has to do with how Amazon compensates its workers.
I'm not all that surprised by the vote. I'm a little surprised that Amazon is so far ahead, but I'm not surprised that they're winning. I think the primary reason I would point to is the Amazon stock price. And this is something that unions are going to run into at all of these big tech companies who, in part, compensate their employees through stock benefits. Amazon offers restricted stock units to most of its employees. Not all, you have to qualify for it. But if you've gotten those stock benefits in the last few years, look at the Amazon stock chart. Everybody's been focusing on the hourly wage, and they do pay above the $15 minimum, which is all well and good. But where you can really do well at Amazon is getting in on that stock plan. And as long as the stock is going up the way it has, I think the unions are going to have an uphill struggle, and that applies to a lot of these big tech companies.
Tying compensation to the stock price is a clever tactic. I mean, it sounds like a good little perk, but what it does is tie your fate as a worker to the company's success, so you're going to be very wary of doing anything that is against management's wishes. But despite all those massive advantages, Amazon still probably engaged in illegal behavior.
Deidre, when you talk to Amazon about that mailbox, which seems to have become sort of a not just a box unto itself, but a symbol given its location and all of the writing on it, is there a real sense of why they wanted to put that up, especially given, by the way, that the other side desperately didn't want them to? So it was confusing to me to see what the advantage for them could have been.
So the idea is that if workers were to vote and put their ballots in that mailbox, they might think that Amazon has some hand in counting them. So they might be intimidated by, a vote to unionize, handing that over to their employer, who is obviously against unionization. That is the union's argument there. Amazon, of course, says that they just wanted to make it easy for people to vote. But Andrew, in the first place, this idea of mail-in ballots was controversial. Amazon wanted to see workers vote in person. The union argued for mail-in. So it goes back, and it's not just the mailbox. I mean, there was another incident, Andrew, where Amazon had the traffic lights changed around the facility so that it'd be harder for unionizers to canvass. So there's lots of little things like that, and we're likely to hear more as we get more challenges once we have the outcome.
And this mailbox is at the center of the union's legal challenge against Amazon's tactics. This is from Alex Press's write-up. She writes, quote, that the U.S. Postal Service, at Amazon's urging, installed a mailbox on company property in time for the mail-in voting period is likely to be a focus of such objections. The company had argued for in-person voting but lost that argument as well as an appeal. The union may argue that this mailbox effectively served the company's purpose, allowing them to monitor voters or the votes themselves. As Applebaum said of the matter this morning, even though the NLRB definitively denied Amazon's request for a drop box on the warehouse property, Amazon felt it was above the law and worked with the Postal Service anyway to install one. They did this because it provided a clear ability to intimidate workers. Hearings will likely follow from such objections, with a resolution potentially months down the line. But despite all that, the result of the election remains a crushing blow. Jane McAlevey has a Bessemer postmortem in The Nation that you should read. It outlines a series of tactical errors that are worth taking seriously, but I am not a labor organizer, so I can't really comment on the actual tactical questions. What I did take from her piece is that we know that in the United States, companies will engage in all kinds of nefarious tactics, both illegal ones and perfectly legal ones, in order to crush unions. That is a given. She quotes a book by a former union buster at length. She writes, quote, read Confessions of a Union Buster by Martin J. Levitt, published in 1988. The book is written by a former hired hand of employers. It's filled with swagger, as it should be, given how many campaigns Levitt helped destroy. In it, he tells the reader, quote, union busting is a field populated by bullies and built on deceit. A campaign against a union is an assault on individuals and a war against the truth. As such, it is a war without honor. The only way to bust a union is to lie, distort, manipulate, threaten, and always, always attack. Each union prevention campaign, as the wars are called, turns on a combined strategy of disinformation and personal assault. And beyond the unique nature of the United States' labor history, which is more violent and repressive than basically anywhere else in the developed world, the fact is that under capitalism, the deck is ultimately stacked against workers everywhere. As sociologist Michael McCarthy writes in Jacobin, quote, the way workers organized is through a union or other kind of worker association. Workers are first organized by a firm, their employer, which brings those workers together based on its own interests and goals. Unions face the difficult task of reorganizing them as workers with interests separate from the management of that firm. Simply put, business power doesn't require a new and separate organization, whereas worker power does. Second, a firm's calculation of its interest is straightforwardly defined: profit. Firms that don't prioritize profit don't survive long in competitive markets. Conversely, a worker's whole life is attached to their employment situation, so they have a wide range of interests tied to that role. Because the full complexity of a human life can't be separated from the labor power they sell to their boss at work, the priorities of one worker at any given time can diverge widely from the priorities of another. Essentially, workers can only win through solidarity. But solidarity is hard to achieve when people are atomized and living in precarity, and that is the status quo for much of the working class, not just in America, but everywhere else. And since the neoliberal assault in the 1970s, union density has been declining. Capital is on the march and is as utterly dominant as it ever has been. Under these conditions, it's a miracle that any organizing campaign is successful anywhere. The problem is that there is no alternative. If we are to change anything, we need to be hyper-focused on labor power. Think about the myriad controversies that dominate the discourse on any given day. 90% of them are nonsense, pure noise, totally irrelevant in a world without labor power. But as bleak as things seem right now, one thing is certain: as long as workers are exploited, they will fight back. Even as workers in Bessemer, Alabama suffered defeat this week, in Chicago, Amazon workers have been organizing for better conditions.
Last April, a group of workers at DCH1, now known as Amazonians United Chicagoland, organized what they called safety strikes, demanding PPE, cleaning protocols, and other COVID-19 safety measures.
People are getting sick, and we weren't notified about it. They would broadcast themselves on social media, letting us, informing us themselves that they were sick or that they had the COVID. So we as a group decided that something must be done.
Amazonians United says its efforts were largely successful. Now their organizing has a new focus. Employees say earlier this year, when they were told DCH1 was shutting down, they were also told their hours would be changed to shifts called megacycles, working 10.5 hours from 1:20 a.m. to 11:50 a.m.
Mothers have to be home with their children because, they have e-learning, or they have to get them up in the morning, or they have to make sure that that they're down for the night. I basically have medical issues, and I just found out 3 months ago that I'm a diabetic. So that's interfering with the schedule that I have to ensure that myself that I'm taking the medication that I need.
Workers came up with a list of accommodations for people working megacycles: a $2 per hour raise, accommodations for employees who can only work part of the shift because they need to care for children or for medical reasons, rides to and from work, which they say the company provides in New York City, and full 20-minute breaks without managers cutting them short.
On Thursday, Amazonians United Chicagoland announced that they had walked off the job. On Facebook, they wrote, quote, "We are proud that most workers walked out today. Less than 10 stayed working. Some joined our rally for a bit, some went home right away. But all of us were busting up laughing because by walking out, we put all the managers to work." Christ, laugh emoji. Y'all know Amazon is always spying on us. They knew we were getting fed up, so they brought new managers in from all over today. Maybe they wanted to scare us. All we know is we made all of them sweat today. It's probably the first time they've ever worked. Our walkout today is us just getting started. Amazon thought they'd get rid of our union by shutting down DCH1 down. But nope, all they did was piss us off even more and help us spread from being at one location to now growing our union at multiple Chicagoland sites. Much appreciation for our community who came out to rally in support for our walkout. And to all of our fellow workers watching, join the struggle. Get it started at your site. Yeah.
Nando, that was a really great segment. And I like the way you ended it with, I think, important messaging about victories. Even if they're small victories, they're still victories. And that helps to galvanize workers across the country. So, Amazonians are kicking ass. And I love that attitude. The one thing I wanted to talk about is this very intentional effort by employers, obviously also by Amazon, to create division amongst its employees. And you brought it up in the context of stock options. And, this is something that really started with a board of investors at a company, for instance, ensuring that executives get paid with stock options. So they have an incentive to cut costs, i.e. lower wages or just fire people, lay people off in order to cut costs and increase profits. And now you're seeing it happen with, a larger body of workers in some instances, like with Amazon, for instance. But, this is something that it's part of a very intentional effort, the stock options part, but it's not the only strategy that employers use. Another strategy that you've talked about actually was implemented in 1945 with Taft-Hartley, and Jane McAlevey gets into it in her postmortem, where essentially, if you don't want to pay dues, you don't have to pay dues to the union in some of these right-to-work states, and that leads to these unions not having the resources necessary in order to, really fight and negotiate on behalf of the employees, and definitely check out Bait and Switch by Barbara Ehrenreich, because she gets into this issue as well in the segment that I'm going to talk about today regarding surveillance in the workplace. I mean, the surveillance programs that employers use intentionally pit employees against one another in regard to performance. And so it's meant to divide and conquer. You see it on a larger level with governance in America, and then you also see it within the workplace with employers ensuring that workers aren't able to collectively work together and ensure that they have a better working environment, better pay, better benefits, and all of that. So it's such an important issue to focus on.
Yeah, and beyond that, just the presence of remote work for a lot of jobs discourages organizing, because it's, at least in the past, organizing has always worked best when workers are physically together, kind of experiencing the same harsh working conditions, and are able to discuss it amongst themselves in person, face to face. It used to be when there was these huge kind of factories, all the workers were just kind of in there together, and they all lived kind of usually in the same neighborhood, right down the street from the factory, and that bred kind of revolutionary fervor, and that's just been kind of totally eliminated by the nature of work and where people live and how they kind of interact with each other, and I think that's something that's been a challenge for modern labor organizers. And I think just in general, the fact that the law is, especially in the United States, is so onerous for workers. I mean, that's why we did the segment on the PRO Act. It would change a lot of these things. It's obviously it's one of those chicken and egg things, and it's very difficult to pass the PRO Act without labor power. It's very difficult to get labor power without the PRO Act. They kind of, that's the vicious cycle that we're in. But yeah, I mean, it's just, you see it all over the place. And it just when you look at the numbers and you look at labor's declining share of income, and you really get the sense that we're in a moment that is very much similar to the heights of the Gilded Age, in which we had, these just monopolists who had unbelievable amounts of wealth, exploiting a huge mass of workers who were getting poorer and poorer every year. A series, just one series after another of economic crises, in which the costs were always borne by working people, and every attempt to organize a labor union back then was often put down very violently. Now they just use all kinds of clever, nefarious tactics to do it, but that at some point that calculus has to change. The dip has to change, and it can happen very quickly once something happens, like some event, these things can spread like wildfire. So we just have to keep pushing. You have to keep going. It seems very bleak. Sometimes it is very bleak, and it could always get worse, but you just got to keep pushing, because when it does turn, the activity is often very, very quick. I mean, we saw just how quickly labor power expanded in the 1930s at the height of the Great Depression, which was just, the bleakest era. All of a sudden, there's this kind of raft of labor organizing that really took the entire country by storm, and changed the world, really. It's one of those things where it's very bleak right now. We live in an era of total capital domination, and we just have to be focused on that. That to me is the lesson after all of this in Bessemer, is that this is the fight. This is the fight. Yeah. All the other fights that we think we're having are nonsense. There's just so much nonsense out there, and it's just a waste of time, energy, resources, everything. It's it's completely useless. The vast majority of the fights people get into on Twitter, the personality differences, like, oh, do you like that person or do you like that person, or, you know, is this person good or is this person bad, or like this issue or whatever. Like, without labor power, none of this is all just noise. This is just shouting into the void, you know. They all washed away. All those tweets are washed away like tears in rain, like Blade Runner said. So yeah.
You know, and I just want to add one more thing, because when you mentioned, you know, they'll usually be one major event that changes everything. I don't know what that event is going to be, but if you look at the broader picture of what's happening economically right now, on one hand, you have workers who are getting poorer and poorer. They're losing more and more of their rights, their benefits, all of that. And then on the other hand, you have an issue with housing, right? Like this story that was published by the Wall Street Journal this week, you know, we talked about it on TYT. I really recommend that everyone read it, because what's happening is you have these developers, these are the builders, right, who are building entire communities with houses and everything. And what do we hear over and over again about the housing crisis? Oh, it's because we have a lack of inventory. There is a lack of inventory, right? But don't make the mistake of thinking that developers aren't building houses. They are. It's just that now they're building entire communities and selling the entire community to wealthy investors, right? And what do the investors do? Well, they're not interested in, they know the market's going to crash. They're not interested in selling those houses. They're interested in putting them up for rent. And so that limits the amount of homes that, you know, couples can buy, like as their starter home. It leads to all sorts of issues. But what do they also do with the rent once these investors are invested in these communities? They have incredibly expensive rent. They don't have any intention of lowering it. Workers are making less and less money. Keep in mind, the investors are over leveraged. We don't know to what extent, but they're over leveraged. They took out a ton of debt in order to buy that entire community. And so what happens when people can't afford those apartments? I mean, it's just a recipe for complete and utter disaster. And it goes to the argument that I think is important about how capitalism, especially late stage capitalism, is full of all these contradictions that eventually leads to a complete and utter collapse. And I think we're headed for a collapse that we haven't experienced before. You know, because you look at the Gilded Age, I love that you mentioned that, and there are so many parallels. I mean, in the lead up to the Great Depression, what was happening? People were taking out a tremendous amount of debt and doing all these risky investments. And then there was panic and people, you know, started selling in the stock market. It led to complete collapse. And it's something very similar is happening right now. And obviously you can also see it with the trends regarding inequality. So we're in for it. We're definitely in for it. And I don't know if that's going to be the event that leads to the change that we need. But I think that you're right in not getting too down about what happened in Bessemer. It's a battle in a larger war, and the war continues.
Yep. Yeah. The war continues. No other choice.
Exactly.